Number 7. Runner. Wireless communication was in its earliest stages during World War I, so militaries relied on other means to relay messages back and forth. The most reliable method of sending and receiving correspondence was through human runners. These runners would go back and forth between units delivering updates. It was one of the war's most important and most dangerous jobs. Runners were typically low-ranking officers who were fit and good at reading maps, according to Doran Cart, who works as a senior curator at the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, Missouri. Speaking to History.com, he further explained that an ideal runner was resilient enough to handle challenging weather and agile enough to navigate challenging obstacles. These lone messengers were almost constantly at risk of being shot while traveling to neighboring units and back. It wasn't a question of if, but when a runner would be killed or wounded, according to a 1931 Hartford Courant article written by World War I veteran Alan Dexter. Most of their time was spent along the front lines of extensive zigzagging trench networks where traveling even a short distance took a long time. The mud was thick, wet, and difficult to move through. Runners played a crucial role in coordinating plans between units. Because the job was so dangerous, multiple runners were often sent out to relay the same message in case they didn't survive the trip. They took different routes to increase the chances of at least one of them reaching their destination alive. Number 6. Fighter pilot. The famous Wright brothers made the first successful aircraft flight in 1903, just 11 years before World War I broke out. By the time the conflict was in full swing, most of the world was infatuated with aviation. Governments recruited military pilots with propaganda that portrayed the job as glamorous and heroic, and the strategy worked well. But aviation was still in its infancy at the conflict's onset, and it was an incredibly risky gig. Military pilots faced some of the shortest life expectancies among the war's participants, surviving for just 10 weeks on average. Most lost their lives without ever seeing combat, including 8,000 members of the British Royal Flying Corps who died during training. Most fighter planes of the era were simple biplanes with open cockpits and crude instruments. They were made from wood and canvas, making them prone to collapsing and catching fire. Planes were not equipped with radios, and the only way for pilots and gunners to interact was through hand signals. It wasn't uncommon for pilots to get lost while flying, sometimes leaving them with no choice but to land in a field and ask locals for directions or fly low and rely on visual aids. World War I was a critical period for aviation development. It was a learning experience that revealed the major pitfalls of early planes and the importance of prioritizing flight safety. Aircraft technology advanced rapidly throughout the conflict, and while flying remained dangerous for a long time, these improvements made it far less deadly. Number 5. Munitionette. A well-supplied military is imperative for success in any war. When World War I broke out in 1914, the British government encouraged women to register for war service jobs to keep up with production demands and so that more men could fight. Thousands answered the initial call, and by the war's end, somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million women were working in munitions factories throughout the UK. The hours were long and the conditions were unsafe for these munitionettes. They performed grueling physical labor, operated extremely dangerous machinery, often while exhausted, and were exposed to toxic materials, including asbestos. In addition to being dangerous, the work was often uncomfortable. Factories were extremely loud, ventilation was poor, and the work was repetitive. The environment made it difficult for many to concentrate on their work, and they were required to meet quality standards despite the tediousness of some jobs and the many distractions around them. Each position came with different risks, and some jobs were more hazardous than others. Workers who were tasked with filling shells often suffered from TNT poisoning. Regular contact with the explosive could cause many different health issues, with liver damage ranking as the most serious among them. The condition turned their skin yellow, earning them the nickname of canaries. An estimated 400 munitions workers came down with toxic jaundice, and around 100 of them died. At the time, there were hardly any laws and regulations to protect employees' health and safety. Workplace accidents were common, and munitions factories workers risked their lives to get the job done. It's unclear how many people died during this period because these tragedies were often withheld from the media. But some accidents were too major to hide from the public. In early 1917, a major explosion occurred at a factory in East London, killing 73 workers and injuring around 400. In addition to the unavoidable dangers of working with highly explosive materials, factories were also prime targets for enemy air raids. The women who bravely and selflessly jeopardized their health and safety to manufacture critical supplies for the military are remembered today as some of the war's unsung heroes. Would you do this job if you were a woman alive during World War II? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. Sapper. A sapper is a soldier who performs various engineering tasks. During World War I, this meant digging trenches, building fortifications and railroads, carrying out demolitions, and performing mining operations. Sappers also set, operated, and guarded tripwires and booby traps, often working in underground tunnels in complete darkness to take out enemy troops. Many of them who filled these shoes were miners before the war or had experience digging tunnels and sewers. The need for tunnel specialists who were used to working underground in stuffy, cramped conditions became apparent early on in the war when the Germans began tunneling beneath Allied trenches and setting off explosives. The British military immediately got to work digging their own tunnel systems, which typically consisted of a main shaft with tunnels leading toward the enemy. This type of warfare proved to be a major facet of the conflict, and the demand for sappers only increased. By the middle of 1916, there were around 25,000 British sappers participating in the war. They had to be as quiet as possible while they carried out their work to avoid tipping the enemy off to their presence. Some sappers wore socks over their shoes to soften the sound of their footsteps, and they often wrote messages and instructions to each other on tunnel walls to avoid having to talk out loud. During their time underground, they were in constant danger of having a tunnel collapse or being flooded out by the enemy. Sappers also routinely worked with explosives, which was unavoidably dangerous. Number 3. Trench Raider. Trench warfare is commonly remembered as a defining feature of World War I. During the early days of war, soldiers dug large trenches as a defense against the enemy. Much like a moat surrounding a castle, it was a way to keep the enemy from getting too close. During World War I, trenches took on increased importance as a way for soldiers to avoid machine gun fire and the destruction of other modern weapons. Trenches also may have provided troops with at least some protection from the harmful effects of mustard gas and other airborne agents that were used during the conflict. In a practice known as trench raiding, soldiers crossed through an area between opposing forces known as no man's land and ventured into enemy territory in the middle of the night. They used this as an attack method and as a way to gain valuable information about the opponent's operations. Trench raids were never carried out during the day because it was impossible for troops to enter no man's land without being seen and most likely killed. But it was possible to sneak across at night. The men who carried out these attacks would creep up on the enemy's night guard and kill him as quietly as possible. They then carried out their mission objectives as quickly as possible, ideally spending no more than a few minutes in the trench. In addition to gathering intelligence, trench raiders destroyed equipment and weapons and killed and kidnapped enemy soldiers. Before leaving, they often threw grenades at sleeping troops. A successful trench raid also inflicted psychological damage and damaged morale by leaving the enemy feeling vulnerable and threatened. But there were plenty of things that could go wrong during these missions. To avoid being bogged down by heavy equipment, trench raiders were lightly armed with old-fashioned weapons like clubs, bayonets, knives, hammers, hatchets, and brass knuckles. In an era of mechanized weapons, it was incredibly dangerous to enter enemy territory equipped for little more than medieval-style hand-to-hand combat. And while some trench raiders carried pistols and other small firearms, they avoided using them at all costs because the noise would give away their presence. Even when trench raiders moved silently, there was always a chance that an enemy soldier would wake up and shoot them or raise the alarm to their presence. Things could take a deadly turn on a moment's notice, including after the raid was over. Upon returning, trench raiders were sometimes mistaken by their fellow soldiers as the enemy and killed by friendly fire. Number 2. Tank Driver. The elusive nature of trench warfare led to a lengthy stalemate along the Western Front during World War I. So, the French and British developed the first ever combat tanks, which hit the field for the first time in 1917 during the Battle of the Somme. The idea was to create an armored vehicle that was capable of traversing over shell holes, barbed wire, and other obstacles with ease. Unfortunately, the first tanks were mechanically unreliable and incapable of barreling through trenches and over obstacles like their developers envisioned. One of the first tanks to be used on the battlefield was the British-developed Mark I. It was prone to breaking down, and only 1/3 of the 49 vehicles made it across the trench. The Mark I's failures resulted largely from its rushed design and production. And while the results were disappointing, they did help to influence the development of better tanks. Most World War I tanks were less than impressive metal hulks that moved at no more than a walking pace. Driving these primitive vehicles came with unique risks, including the possibility of getting stuck in the mud or breaking down on enemy territory. One British tank crew became trapped in no man's land for 3 days during the 2-month-long Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. The 9-man crew advanced into the area after 3 weeks of heavy rain and shelling. It wasn't long before they encountered German gunfire and ended up stuck in a muddy ditch with its back end in the area. In the meantime, British troops began retreating to their trenches, leaving the crew stranded by themselves in the tank. The Germans tried to swarm the vehicle with grenades, and the British soldiers fought back fiercely, but were almost all wounded. This continued for 3 days before the tank crew finally escaped at night under the cover of darkness. By then, they were injured and had drunk dirty radiator water just to stay alive. Number 1. Stretcher bearer. Getting a wounded soldier to treatment as quickly as possible can mean the difference between life and death. Prior to World War I, porters were tasked with retrieving injured men from battlefields and transporting them to medical care. This was done in a relatively unrushed fashion. It wasn't until the Great War that the concept of urgency became a defining factor in the approach to treating wounded troops along the front lines. Stretcher bearers were the forerunners to modern military medics. Realizing the importance of starting treatment on the battlefield, they made it a priority to begin working on injured soldiers as soon as possible. Working in teams of 4 to 6, they loaded each patient onto a stretcher and carried him to safety. They worked as quickly as possible, but were often slowed down by knee-deep mud and rain while carrying a patient in the line of fire. Unfortunately, many wounded soldiers were stuck waiting for days before stretcher bearers arrived, and some died while awaiting rescue. But these early medics did the best they could in challenging circumstances. And it's precisely this dedication that led to further improvements in battlefield treatment as well as civilian emergency medical care. Thanks for watching. Which one of these jobs sounds the most dangerous to you? Tell us in the comments and remember to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.